Okay, so we've been talking about the use of energy by plants and animals and other organisms. So now we're going to talk about how energy moves through a community and through an ecosystem. So you remember that ultimately, most of the energy that runs our ecosystems is from sunlight. And this autotrophs are capable of taking that light and converting it into chemical energy, and that chemical energy then can be used to power the other organisms. So when we talk about the organisms in this food chain or a food web, we can talk about those organisms that are called producers. So the producers are those that are the autotrophs. So they are capable of photosynthesis. So they are photosynthetic. Now, there are a few ecosystems that are not, that is not run by sunlight. There are some ecosystems, just a few of them, underneath the oceans, for example, that are run by gases that escape up through vents in the ocean floor. So when we talk about these producers, they could be things like plants, but in the aquatic environment, they could be algae. They could also be what we call phytoplankton, I meant to write. Phytoplankton. Plankton are organisms that float in the ocean with the ocean currents. And so these would be photosynthetic microorganisms, microscopic organisms that are capable of photosynthesis. Then we have primary consumers. So the primary consumers, and you could write them as primary, that's a 1 with a little 0 at the top. These would be the herbivores. So these would be things that eat plants. So for example, grazing animals like cows would be examples of herbivores. Deer are herbivores, but also those animals that eat the phytoplankton, like the zooplankton in the ocean. So we could put zooplankton. These are microscopic, small, like maybe even krill or small shrimp or small crustaceans that consume the algae. So those are the primary consumers. We then have the secondary consumers. And so we could write it like that, secondary consumers. So these are the carnivores. So they might eat the herbivores. Now, in some food chains, we could continue on. So we could talk about the tertiary consumers, right? So this would be like 3, and they would be something that would eat the carnivores. So a good example of this would be in aquatic ecosystems where we might have, as a secondary consumer, an example would be sardines, which are very small fish. You might have had them in the can, right? Sardines. And then the tertiary consumers would be like maybe tuna, which are bigger fish, right? So the big fish eat the small fish. So when we look at these, this movement of energy, you remember that movement of energy means that some of that energy is lost as heat. And so we lose energy, we lose chemical energy as we move from the producers towards the tertiary consumers. So let's look at a diagram of a specific or a set of specific food chains. So here we have the producers on the bottom. So this would be the phytoplankton. This would be, in this case, desert vegetation. So this is a terrestrial and aquatic. We have the zooplankton being eaten by a bigger fish, being eaten by a bigger fish. And we even have like a quaternary or a 4th level consumer on this side of this tertiary, aquatic food chain. Here we have the grasshopper eating the desert vegetation, being eaten by a snake, being eaten by a great horned owl. Okay. Now, one of the interesting things about these food chains is that they're actually generally much more complicated. So we can talk about a food web. So we can look at a food web rather than a chain. And so notice that there's lots of interactions between different groups. So we're going to be looking at this later on when we start to talk about the interactions between species and how some species in a community like this play a disproportionate role in the importance. And these are called keystone species. So maybe one of these would be an example. If we removed it, maybe it would have an effect on all the others. Now we could talk about ecological pyramids or energy pyramids. So the energy pyramid has to do with the biomass at each level. So this is my biomass at each level. So I could have a very high biomass. This would be my producers. They are taking light energy and carbon dioxide out of the air, and they're producing chemical energy. And then we have the next level. These would be like the primary consumers, the next level, and the next level. Now, generally, I've drawn these actually probably too big, because generally in an energy pyramid, only about 10% of the energy gets transferred. The rest is lost to the environment, and we cannot obtain it back because it is poor energy, poor quality of energy. So there's about a 10% at each level is actually transferred. So if this is like 100, this would be like 10, this would be like 1, this would be like 0.1, right? Very, very small. So when we look at these levels, we can look at the difference between energy pyramids, between ectothermic and endothermic. Now you remember that endothermic means that they're using energy for their metabolism. So you might predict that energy is going to be lost more quickly in a energy pyramid or ecological pyramid that is dominated by endotherms. So I'm going to also write this as not just an energy pyramid, but it is also what they call an ecological pyramid. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Let me get my image up. Here we go. Oops, that's the human one. Let's go back, see if I can find the right image. Here we go. Okay. These on the left are, what are they? They are ectothermic. Notice that there is more levels. So that means that not as much energy is lost. You notice that if these are the same size, this is bigger than this one because of the energy that is required by the mouse. Because it's endothermic, it's always losing heat to its environment through metabolic rate, right? And so we see that there is a big difference between those ecological pyramids or biomass pyramids, they're calling them here, between endotherms and ectotherms. Okay, so let's look at the human example of vegetarians versus meat. So you'll notice here that, how are we going to be able to support a huge population size? So we're going to talk about population growth. We're going to talk about humans and population, but we have gotten a lot bigger. We're headed towards 8 billion, maybe 10 billion humans on this planet. And so you'll notice that vegetarians, that when we look at the ecological pyramid, we see that we can support many, many more people if we're all just eating at that level of the pyramid. If we add in livestock here, notice that we've added an extra step in the energy pyramid so that we now have energy for fewer numbers of people. So if we have fewer people, we could all eat meat. But probably if you thought about the way that we eat meat like every day, that is not a sustainable thing for every person on the planet to eat meat every day or at every meal even, right? So that is not sustainable. So we have to think about how we can be more sustainable if we are going to have a large increase in humans on this planet.